To all of my horror lovers out there, have you noticed that horror movies today kind of feel different? You know, horror through each era of its evolution has given us different elements and aspects that we love about the genre. But the question is, what makes modern horror movies different? Come slide with your boy Tech and we'll uncover differences between the horror of old versus the horror of today. So let's get it poppin'. So, as we already know, classic horror in the 70s gave us a lot of favorite horror villains and some of our favorite horror movies of all time. Particularly in the 70s and the 80s, there was the slasher craze, so that's where we got our Halloweens, our Friday the 13th, our A Nightmare on Elm Streets, so on and so forth. Then as we transitioned into the 90s, we got more self-aware meta movies such as Scream and all of the other movies that tried to be Scream after that. Then as we move into the early 2000s, we have more of the torture horror. So that's where you have your Saws and your Hostels and movies of that nature. But as we transition further into modern horror, then you really start to notice distinct differences between some of those films that came out back then versus the films of today. And one of the big aspects that makes the difference between your classic horror and your modern horror was the shift from the slasher to more psychological horror. As I mentioned, that's moving from the Freddy Kruegers and the Jasons and the Michaels and the Chuckies and all of that good stuff, shifting from that and then moving into more movies like It Follows and Hereditary and many more really dope movies. In our older horror movies, there was more of a focus on, the external fears. So those were the prominent figures that really drove that generation in that era of horror and really had a major impact on horror as we know it. But the difference between some of those movies and the movies today is there are far less movies that are focusing on those external fears and more so shifting over to those internal fears. So those psychological effects and, how different traumas and different real life situations, how they really can impact a person and make horror villains and other horror killers and antagonists out of those internal fears. That's one aspect that's really big in terms of the difference between our classic horror and the horror of today. Another big difference between classic horror and modern horror is the rise of the slow burn and the atmospheric type horror. There's less focus on the jump scare, so just getting somebody to
creatively. We're paying the bills, aren't we? Ah, fuck me, shit!
What?
Jump out of their seat or be startled or shocked by, a quick clip or a quick scene or whatever it is. Whereas now there's more focus on fear and the tension and how everything builds up to the course of whatever the scare is going to be. All that stuff, in my opinion, is extremely impactful because it's longer lasting, in my opinion. Like, you feel like you're in the situation with said character, or you feel like you're involved in that scene as it's happening because it's so slow burn and you're like, oh my gosh, like what would I do in that situation, as opposed to somebody just walking, somebody tap them on the shoulder and then they turn around and boom, it's one of their friends, or it very well could end up being one of the antagonists or whatever it is. But still, we've seen so much of that stuff that, not that we don't necessarily appreciate some of it and how it was done back then, but as far as today, because we've seen so much of that, it's like, okay, how can you go about it and make it more scary? And like I said, building that tension and the slow burn is a really effective technique in terms of making a very good quality horror movie. Less relying on loud sounds and that being the main driver of why a certain scene was quote unquote scary or anything like that. Nowadays, you could get more unsettled by the visuals and eerie sound design and, just like I said, that overall slow building tension. That's what really makes the difference. And another thing that also helps within that is having more complex characters and realistic characters at that. In a lot of our favorite old horror movies, the classic final girl or some of these other characters were relatively flat. I mean, yeah, there are the notable ones like Jamie Lee Curtis or Marilyn Burns or whoever you want to name. But still, at the same time, there were so many characters that were flat and weren't really necessarily relatable and things of that nature, in comparison to today, where that aspect of a horror movie is almost the norm. Like, genuinely, people live for some of the characters and the character development that we get in some of the horror movies today. Because to me, today, in general, modern horror protagonists typically often have much deeper emotional struggles, such with grief and trauma and mental illness, which ultimately makes their experiences that much more relatable and personable. Then there's the aspect of horror as social commentary. Movies like Get Out, The Platform, all of these reflect real world fears. A lot of times in horror movies, they're used to be able to discuss really sensitive topics such as, racism and economic inequalities and social anxieties, and amongst many other things. Like, so many different layers that make a lot of horror movies today feel much more complex. From that personable and relatable aspect, like, you really feel that through the social commentary. And speaking of the movies being more layered, then you have to factor in the blurring lines between the horror genre and some of these other genres, because a lot of the horror movies that we have today, in comparison to some of our older ones, blend much more of the drama, thriller, suspense, sci-fi, pretty much you name it. So movies like Annihilation, The Lighthouse, like, all these things make horror movies a little harder to categorize nowadays, similar to how in the 90s with The Silence of the Lambs, there was, half the crowd talking about it's a horror movie and the other half talking about it's just a psychological thriller. And one thing that I'll say is very underrated in terms of what makes modern horror movies what they are today too, is the level of higher production and the cinematography that goes along with it. Really great cinematography and sound design and direction. So, the artistic angle of direction from people like Ari Aster and, Robert Eggers and Jordan Peele, James Wan, and recently Parker Finn. Like, a lot of these directors really have this nice artistic perspective and view in the way that they shoot their movies, because ultimately with better technology and bigger budgets, horror movies now just have this stunning cinematography where, a lot of these movies might not even have that much of a compelling story, but because the visuals and everything that you actually see on screen just looks so beautiful that you're like, damn, well, this was a banger. I know, like, one movie, for instance, that came out the end of last year, Nosferatu, there's a group of people that complain about, how slow and boring and not a lot happens in it. There's the group that enjoys a lot of that slow burn and pretty much nothing happening. And the one thing that both of those groups agree on is the fact that Nosferatu is shot beautifully, like, everything about it. And ultimately, unique camera work, really immersive sound design is something that really makes the difference in terms of how we view our horror movies of today versus the way that we viewed them in the past. And it's not that a lot of those directors back then didn't have their own artistic angles and perspectives and the way that they shot some of those movies, because some of them are fantastic and legendary in their own right. But it's just, you can see the difference in how it's shot today versus how it was shot back then. Another element that really makes a difference between some of our classic horror and modern horror today is the streaming influence on horror. Because we all know today you have Netflix, you have Paramount Plus, you have HBO Max, you have Hulu, the whole nine. One thing that I would say is beneficial from having all of these streaming platforms is it allows for more experimental horror. So giving the director and the producers more liberty and freedom to take risks with their horror movies. And that's where you get some of the underrated gems in the horror genre. They're allowed to have a wider variety of styles and different storytelling approaches that are really impactful to some of these films. So, like, thinking about The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor, all these shows and movies, really show a creative angle in terms of the way that we do things nowadays. And lastly, there's the rise of international horror, and there are plenty of very good international horror movies. You think of movies like Train to Busan, The Wailing, and many other movies. This has led to more people discovering some of these foreign films, and because of how international horror brings fresh ideas and different cultural fears, it gives you a different perspective and a different lens on, how certain people may view something as terrifying was, because the way that their culture is, that is something that truly is terrifying. So all of these little elements matter. A lot of them have their own unique storytelling as well. So, but yeah, overall, that is really the difference between our classic horror and our modern horror. So you have much deeper themes and stronger characters, generally overall more cinematic storytelling. And as far as which one do I appreciate more, I think they both have made their impact on horror, and I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. Sometimes I really do enjoy a lot of the simplicity when it comes to some of our 80s and 90s horror movies, where it's like, okay, this is the antagonist, this is your protagonist. The protagonist is trying to accomplish this. The antagonist is either trying to stop the protagonist from accomplishing that, or the antagonist has his own agenda and the protagonist has to stop the antagonist. Plain and simple, cool. perfectly fine. But then there are also clearly times where I want to have something that has a little bit of a deeper meaning and some of those underlying themes and stuff like that. Everybody knows how much I love Smile and It Follows and, you know, movies of that nature, and all of those fall in line with everything that we've discussed in this video. So with that being said, Spooky Gang, y'all comment down below, what do you think of classic horror versus modern horror, and do you like some of the differences between the two, and which one do you like more, and what are some of your favorite classic horror movies versus some of your favorite modern horror movies? Y'all comment that down below. Y'all like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 10K subs. We want to keep this momentum going. We want to continue to build off of the 1K subs and, like I said, drive this thing all the way to 10K subs. But yeah, y'all already know. Love y'all, Spooky Gang. Y'all stay blessed and y'all stay spooky.